25 years ago, the people of East Timor achieved something extraordinary: freedom. For centuries, they had endured colonial rule under Portugal. When Portugal withdrew in 1975, their freedom was short-lived. Within weeks, Indonesia invaded, initiating a brutal occupation that would last for 24 years. Despite the violence, the East Timorese people never stopped fighting for their right to self-determination. Their struggle came to a historic turning point in 1999 when, under international pressure, Indonesia allowed a referendum. The result? A staggering 78% of the population voted for independence. It was a moment of victory. The world welcomed the birth of the first new nation of the millennium. Fireworks lit the sky and celebrations erupted across East Timor. But freedom came at a cost. Decades of oppression had left the country in shambles. By 2002, East Timor was officially the poorest nation in Asia. Annual GDP per capita was just under $500, and life expectancy stayed around 57 years. Essential infrastructure, roads, schools, healthcare, was either destroyed or completely absent. This is the story of East Timor, a country betrayed and kept poor for many years by its neighbors. For East Timor's newly elected leaders, the task ahead was monumental. How could they build a future for a nation that had been left with so little? Fortunately, there was a glimmer of hope: oil. Just off their southern coast, beneath the waters of the Timor Sea, lay massive reserves of oil and natural gas. These untapped resources were valued at tens of billions of dollars. If managed wisely, the wealth from these resources could transform East Timor from a struggling nation into a thriving one. In fact, per person, the potential value of their oil reserves was comparable to those of Norway, a nation renowned for turning its oil wealth and prosperity. But there was a catch. The oil and gas fields were located in contested waters. For East Timor to have the right to drill, the fields needed to fall within their maritime borders. And while East Timor believed they did, Australia saw things differently. The two nations had long disagreed over the precise location of their maritime boundaries. This dispute wasn't just about lines on a map, it was about the future of East Timor. Every year of delay in resolving the conflict meant lost opportunities to lift their people out of poverty. The stakes couldn't be higher for this young nation, fighting not only for its independence, but for its right to prosper. The relationship between Australia and East Timor is a complex tale of alliance, betrayal, and eventual redemption. It all began during World War II, when Australian soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with the Timorese, resisting Japan's advances. At the time, the island of Timor was already politically divided, its western half governed by the Dutch and its eastern half by the Portuguese. When Japan's forces moved into the region, the Dutch and Portuguese united in defense, with Australia lending crucial support. Despite their efforts, the islands fell to Japan possession but were eventually liberated after the war, with Portugal resuming its colonial rule over East Timor. Fast forward to 1975, when a rising nationalist movement in East Timor declared independence. However, left-wing supporters' socialist ideals alarmed neighboring Indonesia, which viewed it as a threat. Around the same time, oil fields were discovered in the Timor Sea, and suddenly, East Timor's fate took on new significance. The Australian government, eager for its share of the lucrative oil reserves, felt uncertain about dealing with an independent East Timor. Behind closed doors, Australia and the United States quietly backed Indonesia's ambitions. Just 1 week later, Indonesia invaded East Timor, unleashing a reign of terror. Surprisingly, Australia became the first Western nation to formally recognize Indonesia's sovereignty over East Timor. This decision came at a heavy cost to the Timorese people. Under Indonesia's brutal rule, tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands, died due to famine, violence, and widespread oppression. Shockingly, some estimates even suggest that nearly a quarter of the population perished. And yet, when news of these atrocities reached Australia, the government chose to ignore them, prioritizing its diplomatic ties with Indonesia over human rights. This approach benefited former Indonesian dictator Suharto-era elites, Indonesian generals, and corporate Australia, eager to exploit East Timor's oil and gas reserves. Here's the twist in this fraught relationship. Australia eventually became a key player in East Timor's fight for independence. At least that was what media portrayed. Australia's role in East Timor's struggle for independence was damaged by deception and self-interest. In 1999, after years of struggle and international pressure, East Timor held a historic referendum. When violence erupted in response, Australia led its first-ever multinational peacekeeping mission, deploying thousands of soldiers to restore peace and ensure the transition to independence. This contribution was instrumental in East Timor finally gaining its freedom in 2002. Today, many Australians take pride in their country's role in East Timor's independence, despite the darker chapters in this shared history. Yet, the relationship remains overshadowed by lingering tensions over the vast oil and natural gas reserves in the Timor Sea, a region at the heart of a long-standing border dispute. This history, full of contradictions and complexities, illustrates the delicate balancing act of diplomacy, self-interest, and justice that defines Australia's connection with East Timor. At the heart of this debate lies the Greater Sunrise oil field, a massive untapped reserve valued at an estimated $40 billion. But here's the million-dollar question: who has the right to drill? This all boils down to the placement of maritime borders, and that's where things get complicated. Under UN law, every coastal nation is entitled to a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, EEZ. Sounds straightforward, right? Well, not exactly. When these zones overlap, as they do between Australia and East Timor, the situation becomes a contentious puzzle. Australia argues that the maritime borders should be drawn based on the natural prolongation principle. This principle states that borders should follow the natural extension of a country's landmass beneath the ocean floor. Conveniently for Australia, this approach places some of the richest oil fields, including much of Greater Sunrise, within its exclusive economic zone. On the other side of the debate, East Timor presents a compelling counterargument. The borders should instead follow the median line principle. According to this approach, the boundary should be drawn equidistantly between the two countries' coastlines. And yes, you guessed it, this method places most of the lucrative oil and gas reserves firmly within East Timor's jurisdiction. Over the years, the two nations have managed to agree on some boundaries. Back in the 1970s and 1980s, Australia and Indonesia, the ruling authority over East Timor at the time, negotiated a seabed boundary, a boundary for commercial fisheries, and the so-called Zone of Cooperation. This zone was further split into three areas: one controlled by Indonesia, another by Australia, and a third where revenues from oil and gas production would be shared equally. But here's the catch. Now that East Timor is an independent nation, Timorese officials argue the existing agreements heavily favor Australia. They also emphasize that the original deals were struck not with East Timor, but with Indonesia's government during its occupation of the territory. This historical context, paired with the enormous financial stakes, has added another layer of complexity to an already heated dispute. East Timor freedom was a turning point that reshaped everything. In the lead-up to this historic event, Australia made strategic moves to secure its authority in the Timor Sea. One bold decision came in March 2002 when Australia withdrew its recognition of international bodies responsible for resolving maritime border disputes. Essentially, Australia was saying, "We're not playing by their rules." This left East Timor in a precarious position. Then, in 2002, East Timor finally achieved independence, a moment of hope for the young nation. Just a year later, East Timor and Australia reached their first significant agreement. The previous three-zone system of the Timor Gap was scrapped, replaced by a single zone where East Timor would receive 90% of the revenue and Australia 10%. On the surface, it looked like a win for East Timor. However, the agreement deliberately left out some of the richest oil and gas reserves. East Timor was granted the rights to exploit the Bayu Undan field, which was a crucial step forward for a nation desperately in need of revenue. But Australia, playing a tactical game, delayed signing the agreement until East Timor agreed to another deal, one concerning the massive Greater Sunrise field, which held far greater potential. Knowing East Timor's dire financial situation, Australia negotiated an 82% share of the Greater Sunrise field's revenue, despite the field being geographically much closer to East Timor. And here lies the central issue. Under international law, If maritime borders were properly established, East Timor would very likely secure full rights to the Greater Sunrise Field. But Australia understood the power of leverage. By avoiding a formal agreement on borders, they could maintain control over the valuable resources. As time went on, public outrage grew. Protests erupted in both countries, with activists in East Timor and Australia demanding a fairer deal. This mounting pressure led to a new agreement in 2006. In this deal, the two nations agreed to split the revenue from the Greater Sunrise Field 50-50. However, there was a catch. Both countries agreed to freeze the drawing of maritime borders for 50 years. This arrangement secured Australia's continued access to the oil and gas resources while giving East Timor the immediate financial relief it desperately needed. For East Timor, it was a bittersweet compromise. They got a payday, but at the cost of delaying a fair resolution for another half-century. This marked the beginning of preparations for drilling, an ambitious endeavor that came with huge challenges. Yet, for the first time, there was progress. Progress toward unlocking the vast potential of the oil reserves and creating prosperity for both nations. But just as momentum was building, everything came to a shocking halt in 2012. In a stunning revelation, a former Australian spy confessed that the Australian government had secretly bugged East Timor's cabinet room during their negotiations. They were listening in on East Timor's discussions about the extraction terms for the valuable oil reserves. The betrayal left. East Timor was stunned and outraged. They accused Australia of exploiting an unfair advantage and swiftly took their case to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. East Timor's objective was clear. They wanted the previous agreement cancelled. For them, it was time to finally establish permanent maritime borders, a move they felt was long overdue. But just as tensions were rising, the situation took an even more dramatic turn. Mere days before the court proceedings, Australia's Secret Service raided the offices of East Timor's legal team. They confiscated crucial documents and even seized the passport of the reporter of wrongdoing who had exposed the spying scandal. The raid ignited a firestorm of public outrage, both in East Timor and Australia. Critics accused Australia of trying to strong-arm its smaller neighbor. Meanwhile, the United Nations had historically supported the median line principle for resolving maritime disputes. If the UN's stance prevailed, East Timor was certain to secure nearly all the revenues from the Greater Sunrise oil fields, a result Australia was determined to avoid. Years of legal battles ensued, each side fighting for what they believed was right. Then, in 2016, a major breakthrough occurred. Judges ruled in favor of East Timor, allowing them to nullify the previous agreement and paving the way for new border negotiations. Finally, in 2019, the two nations reached a landmark agreement on their maritime boundaries. The borders now sit near the median line but cut through the Greater Sunrise Field. Under the terms, East Timor receives a much larger share of the oil revenue, 80% if they let Australia process the oil or 70% if they choose to process it within their own territory. This deal wasn't just between governments. Corporate partners also signed on, marking a historic resolution. For East Timor, this agreement is very important. It provides the permanent maritime borders they had fought so hard for and brings them closer than ever to tapping into the resource wealth of the Greater Sunrise Field. For Australia, the deal represents the conclusion of a prolonged and contentious dispute. And so, the chapter closes on this epic battle for resources and sovereignty, with East Timor standing stronger and more hopeful for its future.